Hello folks, I'm Dr. Call, and today we're talking about insulin. So insulin is one of the most misunderstood of therapeutic options that we know of in diabetes. It's a lifesaver, but it's not a medicine. Insulin is a hormone that the body produces, and as such needs to be understood as the hormone. You can't simply dose it up or dose it down as per your convenience or a pharmaceutical prescription. It needs to be self-managed for the most part. And let's understand why that is the case. So when we first eat or consume something, our body starts breaking down the macromolecules, especially carbohydrates, into glucose. Why glucose? Because we need glucose to move around in the bloodstream so that it can go into all the cells that need the energy, and use glucose as the substrate, as the fueling system that basically allows for a cell to produce energy. When there's more glucose than we actually use at a given time, that's when insulin comes out in the body. That's when it gets poured out from the pancreas to tell to signal your liver and your muscle to take away extra glucose from the bloodstream and starts storing it away in the liver as glycogen, in the muscle as glycogen, and over time even as fats. So insulin actually acts for a very short time after you started consuming your food, and once your spikes come up for carbohydrates and for glucose, which means that insulin maintains the homeostasis of your blood glucose. What is the normal value of blood glucose? Fasting levels, it's usually about 120. In fact, normal levels, I should say, is 120. But these are prescribed standards, and what we have to understand is no two people have exactly the same values. No one individual has exactly the same values. So going from the age of 0 to 100, you could have different baseline values at any given point in time, depending on your health conditions, depending on the status of your activity levels in a given day, depending on just your day, or depending on how stressed you are maybe, or psychologically troubled you might be, or how whether or not you have injuries or whatever else. If you have a fever, that changes how much your blood glucose baselines look like. So if someone tells you that 120 is the number to stick with, that is not true. What is true is that you need to figure out what your standard lower levels look like, and usually a range of 120 to 140 is seen as fairly normal. Now if you can't achieve those numbers, that's usually when you're looked upon as somebody with pre-diabetes or diagnosed diabetes. What diabetes really means is a chronic lack of capacity to bring back your blood glucose levels to 120 after you've eaten. Immediately after you've eaten, your blood glucose will shoot up. Whoever you are, Superman, the Hulk, human, whatever, Shaktiman, that's just how it is. Your blood glucose spikes. But it's down to your insulin to bring that down. And if your insulin fails to do that, or if your body fails to come back to normal levels of glucose in circulation, that's when you have diabetes. Okay, now even diabetes are of two sorts. We've had this discussion before in other podcasts, and you know this from, I'm sure, 100 different sources. But this type 1 diabetes, which is an autoimmune type of diabetes, which means that the body's own immune system starts attacking the cells that produce insulin. It sees insulin as a foreign object, almost like a bacteria or a virus. So it starts going against the insulin, and the body fails to make insulin. That's an extremely severe type of diabetes. Individuals who live with that traditionally has been understood to be a disease of the young, so usually they're diagnosed at a young age. However, these days you've got type 1 diabetics who are diagnosed at a different variety of age, and it's a very complex disease as well. But these are individuals who, once they're diagnosed, will always need insulin before they eat a meal. Why? Because they don't produce insulin. Unfortunately, we don't have a cure yet, but of course, that is what a lot of people are working towards. Now, the other type of diabetes is the type 2, which we are also very familiar with from all kinds of buzzwords when we talk about obesity, when we talk about cholesterol, blood pressure, the metabolic syndrome. 90% of the individuals with diabetes tend to be type 2 diabetic. And type 2 diabetes is not a lack of insulin. It's the lack of a response to body's own insulin. It's a condition called insulin resistance, which people live with for years and years before they actually become diabetic, which is exactly why type 2, even though it's terrible, is actually a milder form of diabetes because it can be reversed. It isn't, I wouldn't say curable, but at the same time, far better controllable. In some ways, entirely reversible. So let's think of how exactly insulin works in a type 2 diabetic patient. Rather, I should say how it doesn't work. Let's take the analogy of a lift or an elevator. The maximum capacity of this elevator is 6 individuals. Now imagine 6 people walk in, go to the floor they need to get to, walk out. That is the function of the lift. Everything is working as expected. Now, if in this lift there are stacks of boxes and crates and equipment shoved to the back of the lift, and only 3 people can enter this lift or elevator, then do you think it's completely undertaking its full function? No. So when something has a certain maximum capacity but fails to go through with it, that is almost close to what we expect to see with individuals with insulin resistance. That their body produces insulin. If anything, initially when they're first diagnosed, their body produces too much insulin to almost contradict this issue where the insulin fails to go to the places and react the way it should. It fails to tell the liver and the muscle and the fats to take away that extra glucose so that your blood glucose levels can come back to normal. Now, the number one issue you see, and this is why I say that insulin is one of the most misunderstood of drugs, because it's actually a hormone in terms of diabetes management, is that so many doctors will prescribe insulin to their patients for the one time in the day instead of before every meal. I mean, if you're going to have to prescribe insulin, do it for every single meal, surely. But patients will be prescribed insulin when they don't necessarily need it, and they'll be given insulin levels that just keep going up. So if you come back to the analogy of the elevator, you've got an elevator with a capacity of 6 people. The back of it is completely stuffed, filled with equipment, boxes, cartons, and only 3 people can get inside. You don't solve that problem by trying to push more people into it. You could try doing that, but that means you'll have 6 very uncomfortable people squashed together, possibly in pain, possibly troubled. Or even worse, instead of 6, maybe you try and push in 8 or 10 so that they can squeeze the back of the boxes a bit more. What are you doing then? You're not serving a purpose. The functional aspect of the lift is lost. So the way you resolve that issue is you take away those boxes so that you can fit 6 people inside the lift. Now, think about it this way. If insulin could act on a certain receptor, what they act on in the muscle or the liver or the fats are receptors. And if there are 100 receptors and there are 200 molecules of insulin, but 50 of these receptors are not responding, they just fail to attach to insulin, is it going to help to have 1,000 molecules of insulin, or is it going to help to change those receptors? So anytime you go to a doctor who keeps trying to scale up your insulin levels as a type 2 diabetic or somebody who cares for a type 2 diabetic, question them and ask them, how exactly is this helping me? Are you also changing my metformin dose? Because that is the drug you need for insulin sensitivity. Because what you need is to improve your response to insulin, not give yourself hyperinsulinemia. Why is that important also? I mean, what harm does it do? If you have too much insulin running around in your body, it's still taking away the glucose from your blood. It's still making your muscles and liver take up extra glucose. And if there's no control on insulin, if you're injecting insulin into your body, then you could actually end up with a hypoglycemia. This happens to the type 1 diabetics. You should talk to them about it. They'll tell you how awful it is. Hypoglycemia can put a person in a coma. That is extremely dangerous. It can also cause acidosis. It can cause so many biochemical issues in the body. And you're exposing yourself to it freely just because you don't necessarily understand how insulin doses are regulated. Another thing to understand is that the way diets work in particularly diabetics, for their understanding, insulin primarily only acts in response to carbohydrates. So naturally, nearly all macromolecules, be it fats, proteins, or carbohydrates themselves, there's a small output of glucose in fats and proteins, but the majority of it comes from carbohydrates, which means that insulin is a response to carbohydrates. If you ate 100% protein or 100% fat with no sign of carbohydrates, you wouldn't need insulin. We have a discussion from Sarah Hallberg from my podcast last year for World Diabetes Day 2017, where she covers these discussions, where they've started a whole movement around reducing carbohydrate intake in order to bring down insulin levels to baseline in individuals. And it has astonishingly great results. Now, I understand it's not the most sustainable diet for some individuals, and I think it's something that you need to figure out for yourself naturally. But at the same time, be aware that if for any reason you've taken on a prescribed diet where, as a diabetic, you've gone on to eating just proteins or just fats, or if you think most of your meal comes from protein and fat and very little from carbohydrates, then you don't need that much insulin. And if you keep taking extra insulin, you could end up with a hypoglycemic shock, or you could end up with hyperacidity, or you will have uncontrollable levels of hunger as well. So it's very damaging for the body. It starts aging the body really quickly too. So these are some of the issues we have with the misunderstanding around insulin. What else can I explain? Insulin dosing is something that needs to be specific to every meal. You can't just imagine that it's a one-shot bullet. You definitely can't imagine insulin being taken one time a day and acting as a medicine that affects all day long. Insulin is a hormone. It remains in the body for a very short time. Beyond that time, it's completely destroyed. So if a doctor prescribes to you 8 units of insulin and you're only supposed to take it for the dinner, then rest assured it's only acting on you during that course of time between dinner and the next 2.5 hours at max. It's not going to help you the day after. It's not helping you the day after that. It's definitely not helping you for breakfast or lunch the next day. Right? So what's the point of you taking insulin? If you're a type 2 diabetic, you've got to question yourself in thinking, do I need insulin or do I need to improve my insulin sensitivity? And if it's sensitivity I need to improve, what medicine do I need for this? What sort of activity do I need to improve for this? And what sort of a diet do I need to be prescribed for this? There are dedicated individuals who are diabetes educators who can help you come up with calculators to assess how much insulin dose is needed for certain types of meals. If you don't want to go through all that, and if you think it's too clinical, something I tried to suggest to somebody recently is that try and take your blood glucose values right before a meal and 2 hours after a meal. And remember that your goal glucose, your ideal blood glucose, is between 120 and 140 at normal levels, right? So you're looking to have a level of 120 to 140 before your meal, and you're looking again to come back to that level 2 hours after the meal. If you're failing to do that, then we need to figure out how much insulin you need. Just keep going up on that insulin level without a metric, without an end figure, and all you do is damage your body. I hope that helps a little bit with understanding what insulin can do and how it is a lifeline for a lot of individuals, especially type 1 diabetics. But at the same time, it's a very abused drug for individuals with diabetes, especially type 2. Most type 2s don't even need insulin. more often than not, the first line of defense against type 2 diabetes is always exercise and nutrition. Then comes metformin. Then a number of other insulin sensitizers, and in the very end, you should think about insulin. So if you're being fast-tracked to insulin, change your doctor or get a second opinion, or just start reading around a little bit. And if you are already on insulin, take charge. This is not the kind of drug that you can afford someone else to randomly prescribe to you if they're not keeping very close track of every single value of your system. If your doctor has an update on the smartphone or their iPhones of every single meal and every single blood glucose level that you are projecting, and then accordingly tells you to alter your insulin, kudos, great, that's what you need. If that's not what's happening, if your doctor looks at your values once in 5 weeks and then tells you add 2 more units, add 3 more units, add 12 more units, you can't do that. Insulin is dependent every single time on every single meal. And this is where self-management is so critical. So educate yourself, become responsible for your own insulin levels and your own insulin dosing. There are a number of calculators, there are a number of resources available for this. I will try and add some links for it so you know. I'll also add a link to a book chapter I once wrote about diabetes to hopefully give you more of an idea of how insulin works and what the mechanisms around diabetes and its different forms are, and what some of the early drugs have actually been like in the past, and how they've come to next generation developments that are constantly being put out there to improve the life and management of diabetics everywhere. So again, I hope this helps. If there are specific questions, then you should just leave them in the comments, and hopefully I'll try to address them soon. Sorry if this seemed like a bit of a rant, but it's really annoying to think about the way people treat insulin, because it's an extremely sensitive hormone to be using, and it shouldn't be used so blatantly. So hopefully we'll continue doing more of these talks in the next couple of weeks' time. I'm hoping to make a habit of one a month at least. If there's any topics you'd specifically like to address, then again, drop something in the comments, and in the meantime, stay fit and stay healthy.